From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The new National Assessment of Educational Progress for 2022 scores are out, and the so-called Nation's Report Card is really, really ugly. Uglier than you remember back in third grade. The historic declines in math scores in particular, but in reading too, extraordinary. Closing schools for the pandemic turned out to have been a very bad idea for children. Plus, Britain will have its third prime minister in 2 months in Rishi Sunak, who will take over this week from Liz Truss, who resigned under pressure from her party last week after a mere 44 days. The new prime minister inherits an economic mess, partly of his own making. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I'm with Joe Sternberg in London and Jillian Melchior. Let's first break down the NAEP scores, Jillian. They're bad. Give us an indication of how bad.
Yeah, it is just brutal to look at. I mean, you've got 8th graders losing 8 points in mathematics, 4th graders losing 5 points in mathematics. You've got not a single state, jurisdiction, or large school district that showed improvement in math performance. And then if you start digging into the district level numbers, some of the kids at the worst performing schools just really got clobbered.
That includes a lot of the major cities as well. Give us an indication, Jillian. What does it mean to say that, well, they lost 8 points? Give us some historical measuring point, because the NAEP scores started to be collected, I think, going back to 1992. And doesn't this suggest that at least in math, some of the progress over all those years has been given up?
Yeah, I want to give you a couple examples on this. So just basic grade level numeracy in 4th grade, you need at least 214 points. In Detroit, it was 205 in 2019. So they were already running 9 points below basic numeracy on average. This is just the fundamental things that a 9-year-old should have. So if you look at the effect of the lockdowns there, they had access to in-person education just like 51% of the 2020 through 2021 school year. And lo and behold, those same 4th graders who already were not showing basic math skills dropped another 12 points amid the shutdowns. And that's a dynamic that we're seeing play out in districts that were already struggling and already closed. You've got Milwaukee, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cleveland. 4th graders in all of those districts have now fallen below basic level skills. And those are some of the places where they were only in the classroom or had access to a classroom 20% or less of the time. So I think it's particularly devastating in these places because they were starting at such a low level and the drops that they saw were so large. There's just a question of, can these kids really catch up? And if they can't, what does that mean for their prospects for the rest of their life?
Let me talk about 8th graders, okay? Because this was a measurement of 4th graders and 8th graders in math and reading. That's what NAEP takes into account, at least this round. So the scores dropped to 274. That's out of a possible 500. Possible 500. Okay. So it's not as if these scores were high to begin with. And that's the kind of lack of mastery that we're talking about. I think this is broader than just these big cities. I think this is a dreadful showing across the board. And there's going to be a lot of suburban schools, I think, that need a wake-up call here, too. The so-called better funded schools, schools that have tended to have better reputations. They didn't show themselves to be all that great either. And I think it's a mistake to say, oh, this is just big city jurisdictions.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I think we're starting to see parents catching on to some of this. If there was a silver lining of the school shutdowns, it was that parents could listen in on students' lessons and realize that they weren't getting what they needed at their grade level. So I do think you've seen in places like Virginia a parental revolt around some of this, questioning whether what schools are prioritizing teaching is worth it at a time that kids aren't getting the basic things that they need. So it is a really widespread problem. I would expect parents to be furious. This is a wake-up call, not just for kids' educational progress, but for really the future of our country. I mean, these are the things that kids need to succeed and function in society. And in too many cases, these NAEP scores are showing that they aren't being well equipped.
There's some discussion in advance of the scores coming out wondering, well, would there be a difference that was traceable to the amount of shutdown that different states experienced? Remember, we have had this huge debate over school shutdowns. Florida famously kept the schools open earlier, Georgia as well. Some other states kept them closed longer, particularly big cities. But the results don't seem to have yielded a lot of clear implications in terms of state differences. Now, one reason may be that states are large and the school districts are local, and there's a variation in school districts within states to the extent that they were actually shut down. So it's hard to differentiate by state. Were you able to tease out of the data any difference in states?
Well, you're right that it's pretty complicated, and it is that district to district variance. You can have a state that's fairly willing to be open, but a school district that's not. So it does become complicated. I think one of the trends that I'm noticing as I look through this, again, is that the places that were already really struggling, the places that were already in a lot of trouble, also saw prolonged shutdowns. And the shutdowns there hit kids that could least afford it. And you're seeing that reflected in the scores.
Any differentiation between certain kinds of schools that did better? I saw at least one report. I've been trying to dig into the data and haven't found it, that Catholic schools, which tended to remain open longer than public schools, that they didn't see the same kind of declines. Have you found that?
Well, it's complicated. So they do have in the NAEP scores breakdowns between different kinds of schools, including charters and non-charters. All of this is not extremely clear-cut because you have a ton of other factors coming in. But I think what it does show is patches where certain schools perform better than others within the same geographical area. And I think what the lesson that we should draw from this politically is parents should have more choice. If you have a school district that is failing and there's an alternative in your area that's doing better.
Any examples of that you can tease out where that happened?
I'm looking at the website right now. There were places where the charter schools performed a bit better.
I noticed the Department of Defense education schools also did much better. They lost fewer spots, fewer points if they lost any at all, which is very, very interesting because it suggests that there was more instruction discipline in those schools, more consistent instruction, and that the closures disrupted education much less in those schools. But the broad lesson, I think, here is that shutdowns failed. They failed children. They were a bad idea. You didn't have to do them. Joe, as I recall, Sweden did not shut down its schools. Is that correct?
Yes. And in fact, it's important to remember that because the American left loves to compare the U.S. to Europe, but really what the U.S. did to the schools and to American school children was very different from what you saw play out across Europe, not just in Sweden. I think that there was much more reluctance in many parts of Europe to close schools for prolonged periods of time. There was much more reluctance to impose the kind of policy that you tended to see in the US, for even if the school was open, if the individual child tested positive, they would have to be out of school for an extended period of time. That could be very destructive to that child's learning. You tended not to see that in Europe. You tended not to see things like mask mandates in the schools that can create real problems for children's learning, particularly at the very earliest years. And so I think that it's important to look at these data not just in terms of the comparison across states or districts within the US, but also hopefully over time to be able to use these data to compare American outcomes writ large to what happened in other countries, especially in Europe, that never took the highly restrictive approach to education and closing schools that America did during the lockdowns.
I guess the one question here is what political impact this will have. It's coming out, obviously, shortly before the midterm elections on November 8th. And I think there are not going to be a lot of governors who are celebrating this. I did see a press release from Ron DeSantis claiming some credit for improvements in all four measured areas. That includes reading and math for fourth graders and eighth graders. Best record ever for Florida in those rankings. Number 3 in fourth grade in reading and fourth in math. Not so well at eighth grade, which is down, I think, 21st in reading in eighth grade, 32nd in math in eighth grade. So the decline between fourth and eighth grade, I can't quite explain it in Florida. Julie, can you?
No, I can't. And I think when you get into this data, it does get very complicated because it is so local. But I do think just coming back to that point that the school districts that couldn't afford it suffered the most. You've got Florida, if you look at just the overall points performing at a higher level before the pandemic and performing at a higher level after the pandemic, despite declines in some of those districts than other places. So again, I think what you see here is vulnerable children getting hit the hardest by this. Talking about it in terms of politics, we could call this an October surprise, but it's not really a surprise to anyone. I think parents have been noticing this in their children. It's an affirmation of that, though, and one potential side effect or result of the NAEP scores coming out now is I think parents should turn a skeptical eye to any politician that has been indebted to the teachers' unions because they were driving the shutdowns first and foremost, and it's children that have suffered from it.